Da pacem Domine in diebus nostris, quia non est alius, qui pugne pro nobis nisitu Deus noster.
In this Arab-Israeli conflict, where do you think this so-called Arab Peace Initiative is heading, and will the West support it?
No, the West will do what Israel wants.
The Outremer was something of a unique creation in the medieval period. Lands gained by the First Crusade, which were then governed under Western European Catholic rule over the local population, comprised of several ethnicities and religious denominations. As this land was claimed and maintained by force from the Catholic military occupation, it is clear that the holding of the Outremer can be described as a form of imperialism. This essay will describe and argue the nuances of this, which are manifold. Of course, the Outremer was also a mix of cultures, but the context in which these cultures were mixed is of fundamental importance to gaining an understanding of the character of these Crusader states, so much that this vague statement is almost surreal in its mammoth deviation from an effective summation of the Outremer's workings. You could describe so many things as a mix of cultures, to the point where it doesn't even make sense. Therefore, this essay will discuss these Crusader states and endeavour to explain the character of this type of imperialism that was undertaken in order to hold this area. The period of history which saw the existence of the Outremer, the West European Catholic-controlled territory that was carved into the Levant following the First Crusade, has been politicized greatly over the years, as well as the Crusades surrounding it, of course. With that said, as the word will be used within this essay, it's important to note early on that Franks are not all French in the modern sense. Instead, Frank was a term that became synonymous for Western European settlers in the region, who may have been from a plethora of different ethnicities. Not one country, certainly not that of France, which didn't exist in its future form at this point in history. Nonetheless, modern French historians, seeking to advance a notion of their nation's innate colonial prowess and military might, were keen to make this link between their nation and the Franks, writing in the early 20th century. Those with a mindset laden with colonization theory of one shade or another have spun narratives trumpeting the colonial prowess of their French countrymen, in inverted commas. For example, Grousset wrote a Franco-Syrian nation in 1934, for example. And this was written when Syria and Lebanon were ruled over by modern France as part of a post-war agreement between France and Britain to partition the Middle East in this kind of way. As you may be aware, Britain took Iraq and the surrounding kind of area, and France got Syria, etc. And some of these colonial theory pieces even point to these conquests as a red flag that foreshadow a perceived sadistic European will to subjugate other peoples that would inevitably lead to the modern empires of Europe. Racisms from the Crusades to the 20th century, that's the title of the book, written in 2014 by a guy called Bethencourt, makes a similar cross-period connection, plugging the Crusades into a wider history, reaching a crescendo with the quasi-scientific backing that the slightly mythologized early concept of race received with Darwin's observation of heritable traits, before the eventual discovery of the nature of genetics in a proper sense. Like a mirror image of the aforementioned pro-imperialist French nationalist commentators, historians such as Smale, who's a UK guy writing from the Cambridge University Press, I believe, operate in a similar paradigm, but with an inverted position compared to those pro-imperial Frenchmen, which is that of post-colonial disillusionment. As Smale writes, during the decolonisation of the British Empire, he takes up a more nuanced and critical standpoint regarding the Western settlers. He writes that this ruling class exploited the subject peoples economically, which is a rather emotive term to describe something so commonplace in this period, probably influenced by Marxist theory of class struggle. Nevertheless, he correctly raises the issue of Muslims being taxed more heavily than Christians. This is a Christian equivalent of the Islamic concept of the jizya, a traditional tax imposed on non-Muslims in return for their freedom to opt out of the Islamic faith, as mandated in the 29th verse of the 9th chapter of the Quran. O you Muslims, fight those from among the people of the book, who do not believe in Allah or in the last day, and who do not prohibit what Allah and His Messenger have prohibited, and those who do not follow the religion of truth, until they pay the tribute tax with their own hands, while feeling subjugated and disgraced. That was a quote from the Quran. The protected yet subjugated status of non-Muslims in Islamic society, referred to as dhimmitude, was mirrored here in the Outremer. This kind of theological imperialism is beyond a mere mix of cultures under the control of an elite which happens to be of a foreign ethnicity. Here we see a state where the elite is directly working to privilege a certain group over others. But while certain historians may not mention, this was in fact not something that was pioneered by Europeans and the brainchild of Western Europe, which would allow them to easily plug it into a perceived history of Western domination of the world. It's something that's mandated in the Quran before. If you want to start your history of racisms, like this guy writing in 2014 did with the Crusades, you're missing all kinds of tribal and ethnic conflict and racisms that happened before the Crusades. So yeah, bit of an alarm bell if someone wants to start a racial kind of conflict history that begins with the Crusades, then you know that they're probably trying to imply that racism is a European thing. This is far more glaring looking at other evidence. For instance, it is true that mosque construction in the Outremer was largely blocked by Latin authorities. In addition, some mosques were converted by the Latin elites, and infamously, the Aqsa Mosque, situated in the Temple Mount in Jerusalem, was renamed Solomon's Temple and used as a palace, then as an HQ for its own knightly order, the Order of the Temple. And the Dome of the Rock, which was renamed the Lord's Temple, topped with a cross until 1189, when Saladin retook Jerusalem and commissioned Islamic rituals to de-Christianize the city, alongside the physical removal of iconography such as this. Under Frankish rule, Muslims were generally not allowed inside Jerusalem. As well as this, Muslim citizens were not allowed to wear Frankish clothing, further restricting their rights versus the Christian population, who were under no restrictions on Eastern clothing. This was, like the jizya, an interesting reversal of sumptuary laws Christians under Islamic law were given. It's clear that the Outremer did not apply equality under the law to its citizens, and instead privileged Christians above others, in the same way that Islamic law did. What's more, the appropriation of these holy sites certainly goes beyond a mix of cultures, as this silly title says, in an innocent and kind of accidental way, as that might imply. It is an assertion of a literally physically dominant culture over another culture in a certain territory. Surprisingly enough, despite the fact that the Catholic authorities furthered the interests of Christians above their Muslim and Jewish subjects, most Muslims in the Outremer willfully continued to live in these lands. An account from the Hadith scholar Dia al-Din al-Maqdisi describes a brutal ruler in Baldwin of Ibelin, a Catholic ruler, who would levy crushing taxes and mutilate his Muslim subjects. In response to this, Ahmad ibn Qudama, a local religious scholar who had fled to Damascus in the face of such a threat of mutilation, attempted to call his family and others to flee as well. He raised a call for the inhabitants of the 9 villages of that land to leave their oppressive situation behind and go to Damascus, couching his argument in the Hanbali school of Sunni Islam, which requires Muslims to leave infidel territory instead of remaining to support them. Shockingly, given these factors involved, only 139 people responded to the call to Damascus, and the villagers who remained tried to prevent them from leaving, and they even alerted the Frankish authorities of the situation, although the migration was not stopped. Here, in what appears to be nigh on the perfect situation for maximum Muslim resistance, the response is surprisingly pro-Frank, especially when you consider the fact that villagers leaving would mean a harder life for those remaining after losing this manpower. Regardless, this account does show the inequalities of Outremer society, and the fact that religious fervour could play a big part in exacerbating divisions by supplying a powerful reason to call those who worked peacefully with other groups traitors. It also shows us that this is sort of normal enough that even though they're in an unequal society, these Muslims are not so incensed that they will even leave to go to Damascus. The Iberian Muslim Ibn Jubayr passed through Frankish lands on the way to a Hajj he was taking in order to cleanse the unholiness that he had accumulated when he drank 7 cups of wine. And if you don't know about the Hajj, this is a pilgrimage to Mecca that Muslims take. I think you're supposed to do once in your life minimum, but you can, if you're too poor, you don't have to go, or if you're sick or something. But also, I think you can go just for the sake of it if you want to sort of cleanse your sins, like this guy's doing. He was a writer and made some highly illuminating remarks about the Muslims under Frankish rule in these lands. He suggests that they were in contentment to live under Frankish rule, implying that the Franks demanded relatively little tribute from them, and otherwise left them alone in uninterrupted land estates and orderly settlements. That was a quote. Going on to declare that this state of affairs is a crisis caused by the harsh rule of Muslim leaders against their co-religionists, who tax them more heavily, and so these Muslim peasantry instead, quote, cherish the conduct of their opponent and enemy, the Frank who rules over them. As Ibn Jubayr was in the process of a Hajj at this time, it's likely that he was in a state of inflamed religious fervour, and so his emotive rhetoric should be understood in this context. And what's more, as a learned Muslim in this period, it's likely that he was associating the Outremer with the massacres that the First Crusade previously inflicted, such as that which was unleashed on the population of Jerusalem when it fell to the First Crusade. And bear in mind, the crusading army of the First Crusade is not the same exactly as the occupying forces of the Outremer. A lot of them go home and new people move out there. It's not the same people directly, although some of them are the same, and also it's not necessarily the same energy, so to speak. These are people who are attempting to settle this land and make their own sort of fiefdoms there, as opposed to the people who are in like a state of religious fervour trying to take Jerusalem, who've made a Crusader oath, etc. So, but it's understandable that this guy would have associated the Outremer with that. It seems the reality of day-to-day life in this time period was not as contingent upon the culture or character of the ruling elite as a modern audience might assume, at least in a rural agrarian community, which is completely foreign to us. Even if you live in a rural area in the modern world, very few places are going to be anywhere near similar to a medieval Middle Eastern farming village. It's possible that some of these rural Muslim communities were not as domesticated to a properly informed Islamic worldview as we might assume, given that it took until the early modern period for many folkloric quirks of belief that technically constituted minor heresies to be purged out of the peasantries of Europe, by way of comparison. People would believe that there were fairies that lived in rivers that gave them wishes and, you know, all these kind of folkloric things which are hangovers from pagan times, but, you know, technically are kind of against the Bible. But it took a long time for your average, completely uneducated person to be aware of all the nuances of the laws of the Bible. Do you understand what I mean? Anyway, this is kind of backed up by history when the letter of the Bible, so to speak, becomes more and more popularized. It's kind of discovered that there's a lot of kind of minor heresies going on in the peasant population. And this is in the early modern period. So after Tudors. Nonetheless, whilst it seems to be true in some cases that even on top of this extra tax for Muslims, a sufficiently lower rate was demanded in comparison to some Muslim-controlled lands with particularly high tax rates, that Muslims were better off financially in the Christian lands, despite their oppression under the law. The fact remains that the existence of these taxes along religious lines is evidence for a kind of theological imperialism, of course. The jizya on one side and these Outremer taxes on the other, the Christian version, both mark out lands where the in-group and the out-group are privileged and prosecuted along religious lines. It just doesn't fit so neatly into an idea that this sort of in-group, out-group preference is a purely European phenomenon. As the guy that wrote the Racisms book might like to imagine. Okay. Another thing to consider, I didn't put this in the essay, but I'm just adding this. Another thing to consider is that the guy who was on the Hajj writing this, he might be writing this as a way of sort of deliberately making things seem worse than they are, to try and shame Muslim leaders into treating their subjects better. Do you know what I mean? He might not know for a fact that these taxes are the way that they are, and the Muslim taxes, by and large, are worse, you know. You can't assume that he has all of the data on this. But he's, you know, it could just be a piece of rhetoric. Because as is on Hajj, he's thinking like, hey, Muslims should look out for each other, sort of thing. Why, you know, Muslim leaders should be really nice to their subjects. And so he writes that as kind of like a piece of political activism, almost rhetoric. Okay. I didn't put that in, obviously, as I don't want to sort of attack my own point. A key difference between the modern perception of imperialism and the reality of the Outremer is the fact that the states formed in this period were not overseas outcrops of a pre-existing nation directly, in the modern sense, a notion that the existence of which in this period is debatable. So as in the idea, the modern idea of the nation is as in like the government is an extension of the people, etc. All these thoughts that are actually quite sort of hyper-nationalist are actually a modern thing. Be surprised how nationalist the modern period is. Looking back on it in this period, which is so globalist, but it's still very true. Our idea of the nation state is very sort of nationalist, clue in the name. These lands were mostly private possessions, acquired personally by the ruler and divvied up to a useful military supporting base in traditional feudal manner. So these were very personal, private sort of acquisitions, almost like some kind of libertarian dream. But not really. These military occupiers, although mostly Western European, did not even come from a uniform ethnic group. They were Flemings, Normans, Germans, Italians, Lothringians, and others. So like I said, they're referred to as Franks. Oh, and I go on to say this anyway. Collectively referred to as Franks in literature, but this is not accurate. It simply became a catch-all term for them. Although, you know, the majority of them are from sort of French-speaking lands, so there is a reason why Franks in particular became the catch-all term. Some historians have argued that the Outremer was an assimilating cultural mix, basing this assessment on the fact that some Franks lived alongside local Greek Orthodox Christians, and some literature depicts good relations with them. For example, Fulcher of Chartres, I think that's how you say that, painted a picture of multicultural harmony and a total Western assimilation in his writing, remarking that whoever was a Roman or Frank has become a Galilean or a Palestinian. We have forgotten our birthplaces. But with this piece of writing, it's likely that he wrote his passage in order to encourage more Western settlement to the Holy Land, portraying it as an easy and financially beneficial move, and playing on the exotification and religious mystique of places and names that were mentioned in the Bible. So, do you get what I mean? Like, whereas in today's climate, mentioning Middle Eastern places, people might be worried about terrorism or something. He's sort of playing it up because the names mentioned in the Bible are really sort of appealing to people. So people would read that passage about becoming a Galilean and be like, whoa, I can really get close to God because this land is literally considered holy. You could view it all as one big relic. If you're familiar with the idea of a relic. However, there are also examples of disparaging literature against Greek Orthodox Christians, which is the kind of the ethnic group in these areas which people might assume are completely fine. They're sort of loving the fact that the Christians are in control and, they're getting along really well. But the Greek Orthodox Christians had many foreign customs and they spoke Arabic, a lot of them as well. They also circumcised their males, and traditionally they branded the foreheads of their babies, which are obviously foreign customs to the Catholics. So yeah, despite the fact that you hear Greek Orthodox Christian and you think that they're going to click along fine, not necessarily. James Vitry, a canon regular who would become the Bishop of Acre in 1214, railed against them alongside the Jews for being a weak, quote, ethnicity, which produced effeminate males who learned the languages of others, apparently because they couldn't fight for themselves. And because of this, they couldn't be trusted as allies. Bishops who could not share dioceses with one another became for the most part Latin by the preference of the rulers, and so other denominations, were overseen by Latin bishops, at least on paper. Aside from this, however, after the conquest of the First Crusade, the Orthodox Christians as well as the other lesser denominations, including Ethiopian Christians, Coptic Christians, etc., were mostly left to their own devices to worship as they would, without a concerted attempt to bring them in line with the Roman Church. It is clear that the conflict on this frontier was quite strongly racialized. Catholic accounts describe assorted Muslim ethnic groups as a cruel race and other such expletives. And if you read sort of the speeches that are designed to motivate people to fight in the First Crusade, they will describe them as a cruel race, reference their ethnicity in the way that they are evil. Dehumanizing depictions and stereotypes seem to be common as these opposing groups described each other. Uzaman ibn Mundkid, a noble Syrian Arab, as in a nobleman, described Franks as animals possessing the virtues of courage and fighting, but nothing else. The impact of this angle of the conflicts in this region on the Outremer is perhaps illustrated most viscerally, however, by the tribalization of sexual relations between these groups. Sex between Christians and Muslims was forbidden in the Outremer, to be punished by castration for men or the amputation of the nose of a consenting woman. Furthermore, it seems rape and fear of rape was common as a kind of terror weapon between the aggressing sides, as this would undermine the perceived purity of a woman and a family at large, inflicting a fate worse than death, which would also likely follow at some point if they were captured. Lebanese author Amin Maalouf said that all Arabs remembered the Crusades as an act of rape, quote, on some cross-civilizational level. He was writing in 1984, and it's likely that Maalouf was influenced by post-colonial theory as he incorrectly traces the Crusades as a course of both the rise of Western Europe as a global power and an alleged decline of the Muslim world, which is a ridiculous assertion. He's seemingly drawing comparisons from modern history to the period he's commenting on, with a lack of regard or even knowledge for the many years in between them, wherein it is more accurate to say that the Islamic world flourished and Western Europe floundered to some extent, at least until the later part of the early modern period. With this said, his emotive description of these events shows some of the viscerally powerful emotions that these cross-cultural, cross-religious and cross-ethnic conflicts invoke in people. Because of the same emotive pull, events of the Crusades would be used as rhetoric by Islamic militants like Osama bin Laden in order to rally Muslims to defend the Islamic world that they saw as under threat once again. While it's true that the Crusader states are an example of imperialism, the idea these events of the Middle Ages could be considered as an early experiment in imperialism is strikingly ignorant. The Roman Empire, which formed the basis of Latin and Orthodox Christendom in this period, was of course imperialist for much of its history, but it would still be a highly debatable notion to assert that even this example was an early experiment in imperialism. It stood for hundreds of years as an extremely powerful state, and was by no means early relative to other examples. The Akkadian Empire rose and fell in Mesopotamia before 2000 BC, and while this is described by some as the oldest world empire, there have likely been imperialistic entities or experiments in imperialism that existed and left no significant written or archaeological record yet discovered, which are still older than that of the Akkadians, as will be explained. The Oxford Dictionary defines imperialism as a policy of extending a country's power and influence through colonization, use of military force or other means. In light of this definition, it seems that Stone Age aggression from one tribal group against another, provided that it was done deliberately in order to make the aggressing tribe more powerful, could be deemed as an early experiment in imperialism, or even imperialism proper. In this context, calling the Outremer an early experiment in any sense seems ridiculous. Years of the Outremer are closer in time to the year of writing than they are to the Akkadian Empire, or anything that came before it. Hardly early in a history of imperialism, when you consider that how broad the definition is. After the existence of so many empires and imperialistic actions, the idea that this imperialism could be considered an experiment is somewhat bamboozling to the mind of the reader, if the reader's properly switched on. It's clear that historical hindsight is being applied liberally in the formation of such a question, as it seems to be connecting European imperialism of the late early modern and modern period, which is a particular form of imperialism, to the actions of Europeans in the medieval period, with a lack of context of what came before or between these events, or even events that occurred in other parts of the world before direct European involvement. It implicitly sort of asserts that modern European empires were the final form of imperialism, and other imperialistic actions were merely experiments. Thus, they were attempts at reaching this final goal. This is fundamentally incorrect. Imperialistic actions have been relatively common on all continents of the earth, as well as across periods of history, and are of course adapted to the means of the nation or people undertaking them. The fact that modern European powers use telegraph cables and gunboats to further the ends of their empires, or that in an earlier imperialist group such as the medieval Mongols or Latin Christians in this case did not have access to those things, does not mean that this earlier endeavour was an experiment to reach this later goal. It was simply imperialism using lower technological development, and far from an early example of it, with this whole history of imperialism considered properly. While the Oxford Dictionary definition of imperialism specifies that it occurs on behalf of a country, which is not necessarily the case of the Outremer, as Crusader states created themselves independent from any state on the mainland, it's reasonable to describe the Outremer as a form of imperialism. This could perhaps be described as a theological imperialism. The country, in inverted commas, that it was conquered to benefit was the somewhat cerebral notion of the country of Christendom, and it privileged Christians within its borders, just as Muslims did so in the lands that they conquered after the emergence of Islam. Another example of theological imperialism. As described earlier, the idea that this imperialism should be described as an early experiment is incorrect, but still more incorrect would be to dismiss any claim of imperialism and describe the Outremer simply as a mix of cultures. As detailed previously, regardless of culture, all ethnicities of Latin Christians, as well as native Christians, enjoyed benefits that the Muslim natives did not, and the Latin Christians occupied the noble military aristocracy almost exclusively. Catholic clergy were also privileged above other sects of Christianity, and consensual sex between Christians and Muslims was punished harshly. Although it's true that many different faiths and ethnicities lived within the Outremer, it was a hierarchical state in which the aristocratic military elite showed preferential treatment to those closest to their group.